Welcome to the Leadership Table, where we sit down with people across the spectrum who play an influence in shaping our communities, impacting our culture, and making a significant impact in terms of service and wisdom and what they provide for those of us trying to make a difference in other people's lives. I'm your host, Dr. Kevin Hairston, and you're with me today on the Leadership Table. Thank you for joining. And we always want to remind everyone that there's room at the table. And today we have the honor to have who I would consider a great friend and a valuable asset to the Columbus community in the Franklin County area of Central Ohio, Ms. Judge Bill Hedrick. Me and Bill go back quite some time. And as long as I've known him, he's been a stand-up person who went from the prosecutor's office to being a judge. He's a person who stands up for those who are fighting for fairness and wanting equity in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Bill Hedrick. Judge, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, and I consider it an honor for you to be on the Leadership Table.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I'm happy to be part of your program.
You know, for those who are familiar with you in Franklin County, some may be familiar with your story, but then there's perhaps others who are not as familiar with your story in terms of what inspired you to go to law school and then what inspired you to become a judge. Can you share with us a little bit about that journey?
It's a long journey, and it's had a lot of different twists and turns over the years. I originally came from. I always tell people when I was campaigning, a lot of people tell about what their background is, and I always tell people I can sum it up with what my real legal name is. My legal name is Billy Ray Hedrick. That in itself provides a narrative. And that was sort of the narrative of my life. I was originally born in Southern Indiana, a rural background. No one from my family or my extended family had even went to college. I started out, I didn't even know I was even going to go to college. I started out as some friends that went to a junior college, which was 20 miles from where I was from. So I originally went to a junior college, a small university called Vincennes University. And I just originally was just going to I wanted to be an accountant, or at least I thought I wanted to be an accountant. And then that led to sort of an educational odyssey. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. So along the way, I was getting degrees, and I always tell people the background behind me, you can see these are all the degrees that I obtained over the years, and you can see what's done with them. They're on my wall in my office. But so I originally got an associate's degree in a business administration. I went to Purdue University. I decided I did not want to be an accountant. I decided I was going to try to be a high school teacher. I decided I didn't like that after I student taught. I didn't think it was the right fit for me. I started a master's in history. I didn't finish that. And I had a friend that was in library school. So I got a graduate degree from library science. And I was actually an academic librarian for 3.5 years at Purdue University. While I was a librarian, I went ahead and finished the history degree that I did not complete prior. And then I decided along the way, I wanted to go to law school. And there were a variety of reasons over the time. I was always involved in politics, and I was always involved in social justice issues. And I thought getting a law degree and being a lawyer would most fit that. When I originally went to law school, I wanted to do employment discrimination and that type of thing. And I actually had a legal idol that inspired me at the time. There was a gentleman, Morris Dees, who set up the Southern Poverty Law Center. He was most famous. He initially did a civil lawsuit where he bankrupted a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan and seized their property through a civil suit. So that was sort of who my inspiration was. Now I tell people that maybe I didn't rise to that level, but while I was in law school, I started working at the city attorney's office. It had never been my intent to ever be a prosecutor or go into that line of work. Particularly, I think my politics, I thought maybe I was probably too liberal to be a prosecutor, but I realized a prosecutor is a very powerful position. And if we just let that field go to those who maybe have different viewpoints than I had, I thought I could bring a new balance. And I was very lucky. My first job, Janet Jackson, who was city attorney when she became city attorney, She hired me as a prosecutor, and she did a really good job of mentoring me and being supportive. While I worked in the office, I also was assigned to Rick Pfeiffer's courtroom. He was the environmental judge who had a very good reputation and still does for out service and service to the community and advocating for those who need justice. And I worked in his courtroom for 3.5 years. In fact, the courtroom I have now as judge in these current chambers was his former office. So I've taken that. And when he became city attorney, I worked for him. So over the years, I had a variety of titles. In 21, I finally decided I'd make the jump and run for judge.
Well,
So that's a lot of jumping around there, but that's sort of a little bit of a summary.
no, I appreciate that narrative. And I think to any young person or any person, man, who is thinking about going to law school, one, I want to compliment you for your transparency of showing your office because I think, most people, when they think of a judge, they see people who are on the court stand and they're in the row, but, your vulnerability and being able to go, hey, here's my office. Here's, my journey is represented in these degrees. And Judge, that leads us, to the next, perspective, and that is when we talk about leadership, um, court TV, if we're just going to be honest, sometimes clouds the mind of what we see in terms of judicial justice. How do you see it in terms of being a real life judge, in terms of applying accountability at the same time trying to be fair, at the same time trying to be firm, but wrapping that all together? How do you see that when you go into the courtroom?
Well, first, I also like to explain there's different kinds of judges and the kind of courtroom I'm in. Now, I used to tell people it was a very inarticulate way of saying things. Common pleas would be more serious charges such as murder, that type of thing. It would be something like you would see on the program Law and Order. And the municipal court is lower level stuff. So it's anything from traffic tickets to low level shoplifting. More serious cases are domestic violence. So we truly are the people's court. Like yesterday, I had 63 cases in my courtroom. So one of the things we address here, when I was a prosecutor in this court system for years, that it gives me the background. We're generally not dealing with bad people. We have some people that sometimes they've made some poor choices. Sometimes they're here, circumstances of different kinds have brought them here. One of the things we have to try to do in this court, the most you can do in jail on a misdemeanor is 6 months. So I'm not imprisoning people and I'm not doing that type of thing. Now, again, being in jail for 6 months is not something that would necessarily be enjoyable either. What we try to do here, municipal court, we try to make it go beyond the numbers and we try to look at the human factors that are involved. One of the things that I've been really pleased with over the years, the court system's become much more progressive. And we do have a number of specialty courts that we can also filter people to. So if they're here because they have ongoing mental health issues, we have a mental health court. We have a veterans court. We have a drug court. We have a court for victims of human trafficking. So we have a lot of programming. Also, our probation department provides a lot of services. So what we try to do, we truly try to do restorative justice versus, punishment. There is a time and place for punishment. Often the people that are going to be the more serious threats to the community will unfortunately graduate to common pleas and commit a felony. So the hard part here is dealing with the volume and trying to maintain each person's story that's before you. And that's a thing I had to deal with as judge, that I don't want people just to be numbers.
No, I appreciate you saying that. And matter of fact, I do want to pick up in just a moment about mental health and those type of challenges that people face, and even restorative justice. But let me ask you this question: when you're looking at your population, I mean, you're a Franklin County judge, and so you're not just in convents of Columbus, but even the suburban communities. And Columbus is one of those unique areas where it has a suburban community within the pockets of its own city. And so you're looking at cases that provide a level of diversity across the board in terms of inner city and even suburban, maybe even touches of ruralness. When those cases come to you, how do you really see your role in helping to shape community? What's community look like when you're dealing with that level of diversity that comes into your courtroom?
Well, at first I have to say, I don't want to over exaggerate a role of a judge, because obviously prosecutors play a very important role in
Hmm.
this, and defense attorneys. Often as a judge, I will work with the solutions that people have. Um, but I also recognize different areas of the city or different suburbs that we cover. There's different types of crime, and there are different issues in those communities. You know, what you would get from a case in Reynoldsburg, which is handled by the Reynoldsburg prosecutor, my courtroom, is not going to match what charges I have for people that were charged on the hilltop.
Hmm.
So you try to balance those things out. Often, too, a lot of things involve listening. Particularly defense attorneys, I will listen to what the situations are of their clients. Often, I will say over time, I think prosecutors have actually gotten to do a much better job. I think uh, the current city attorney and the last two city attorneys in Columbus, I think have always been very justice oriented. So I think we've had on the municipal level, I think we've had prosecutors that recognize sometimes people have problems, and again, they want to work towards solutions. My thing is, I want to make sure my number one goal in the courtroom is that people, A, feel like they were listened to, and B, regardless of what I may or may not do, they feel they were at least respected.
When
Um,
when
I
people,
will often even engage in defendants to a certain level. I'll ask, what brought you here? What's going on? And I have been very surprised. People are very frank and will honestly give you honest answers on why they're here before you very often.
and I appreciate you what you just said, because I can imagine your role. There has to be a level of emotional intelligence that comes with it, a level of empathy that comes with it. But in all honesty, there is that aroma that in some cases certain communities may say, I don't trust the justice system because I've seen where it's been unfair and tainted, and maybe perhaps other arenas, maybe in other cities or maybe other courtrooms. What do you say to those individuals when they're standing before you, or maybe perhaps you're talking to a group and you're trying to regain the trust of the judicial
Yeah,
system?
I think part of it is you do it based on, how you treat people. Because, I'm a man of a certain age with a certain look. So, often, defendant comes and sees me, they may be like, this ain't going to be good. For what,
Mhm.
uh, I think you base a reputation on how you talk and how you treat people. And rightfully so. eh, I'm not going to be one of these people to say there aren't inequities in the system and there aren't some problems in the community. Um, I recognize those. I try to recognize those issues when they come before me. There'll be some things I'll see, and I might be suspicious on why this person might be in front of me and what brought them there. I try to take in line what people's backgrounds are. I try to be fair. Um, I tell people every person has certain biases. And one of these things you have to do is you got to try to work beyond those biases, and you got to recognize those things within yourself. And again, I think over time you develop a reputation with people, how you treat people. And honestly, I found out even when people are in jail, people in the jail know which judge is who.
Right.
And they'll often tell people, now there's certain things I will tell you. If you were, only 24 days a year do we arraign prisoners. If you were charged with a serious felony charge, I probably wouldn't be a popular judge on setting bond on that, because I'm relatively harsh on those because I don't normally handle felonies. But I think if someone is on my docket, I hope I've developed a reputation of fairness. But you're always going to have people that aren't happy with you. You're always going to have people you're going to have to recognize yourself. There's some people, your defendants, you try not to make it personal, but there's some people you don't like, and you have to work around that. Now, one of the things I had to adjust to when I first took the bench is trying to recognize. I will tell you, most of the time, I'm shocked how cooperative and unproblematic most defendants are, or people charged. They're usually respectful. And I quickly learned a lot of those, if they weren't and were raising their voices, there was often a mental health issue there. So it's trying to recognize why this person's in front of you and why they're acting the way they do. Um, I tell people to be honest with me, and I think if I'm honest, I'm honest with them. They're honest with me. I will give you examples. I will do some things that are a little bit more unconventional. I learned a lot of these things when I stole ideas from other judges I practiced in front of. And like, for instance, Rick Pfeiffer was the environmental judge before he was city attorney. He never took the bench. He sat at a table and would talk directly to people. Now, I can't do that on all my cases because I don't think it's appropriate, because I would not want to have someone who's charged with assault sitting in front of me, not because I'm concerned for my safety. I don't want victims in the courtroom thinking I've made this person my best friend. I don't think that's a good, because I have to balance the interests of victims as well,
Right.
and that they feel heard in a courtroom. But there are things, for instance, like this week, I had a lady, she had a warrant for arrest. She had been arrested because she didn't come to court. And she couldn't post the bond. It was a low bond. And her attorney says, well, she says, she didn't do this, but she needs to be released. You need to lower the bond. And she'll come back to court. Now, rather than just listening to that, I actually went back in the holding tank and I said, Miss So-and-so, you didn't come to court. I'm very disappointed. Now I'm going to let you out. Am I going to regret my decision? And I also think it makes a statement. The other prisoners are back there too. And I'm like, that the judge is I'm willing to go back there. Now, it's with the permission of the defense counsel. I will go back in the holding tanks and talk to the prisoners if I think it's a personal message I want to convey to them. If people come to my courtroom for expungements or sealings, those are things I will actually leave the bench, sit down at a table with them, and go over their paperwork with them. And if they're qualified, we sign it. If they're not, I explain it to them why not. If they're before me for a revocation hearing, I will often, as a first step, I will talk, and they don't have an attorney, I will sit down again at a table with them and I will go over with them what they're doing or what they're not doing. And if I think they need to get a lawyer, I'll tell them to get a lawyer. I also will bring people back in my chambers and talk. Now, my secretary is always listening. We've been lucky. I haven't had to call security yet. But I also will often engage too. Attorneys will say, are okay with me talking to their clients on certain issues. Or I'll say, if I'm bringing someone before me in court and I want to discuss something with them, I'll ask their lawyer, how are they going to react? Because again, I don't want to provoke someone when their attorney's standing next to them. They're not going to get to me. They're going to cause a problem for their attorney. I don't want to cause safety issues for their attorney. My other goal is I will lecture people in court, but I do not want to embarrass people in court. And I do want them to feel that they can talk and they're not punished for sharing what their opinion may or may not be. There are also certain charges, if people are going to plead guilty on, a courtroom's a public place. If somebody wants to wait towards the end of the docket to argue their case or plea in front of me versus being in front of 40 people, I'm willing to do that. Now, there are times and places I do want to make an example of someone in a courtroom, and I want everyone to hear. And I also want victims to be heard. So often if a victim will speak, I will go on the record and I'll make it clear to the victims, particularly when someone has pled guilty, because that means they've accepted responsibility for the charge. They're not innocent. And for instance, I had one the other day. I had a lady, she was charged with violation of protection order. And the protection order was, it involved a charitable organization in Columbus that helped people. And I guess she had, for whatever reason, was terrorizing this place that I know was helping people. So I was not happy. And I let her know I wasn't happy. And she was on probation. And I made it very clear if there was any more of this behavior, I wouldn't hesitate. And an employee from that agency was there and spoke. And I hope that they felt that they were heard. I also will lecture if there's a victim there. They can make statements. I'm like, take whatever time you need. Make sure I'm trying to be attentive and listen. If you need to take a break, I may ask you questions if that's all right. I will also, other things I do, I think they're little common touches I do. If a defendant comes and they have a family member that's come to court, I will point out to them, look, your mother, your sister, your loved one is here. I have 90% of the people that come before me that don't have anyone. So you have someone in your life who cares about you. Use this as a foundation. You have something to work with. A lot of people don't even have that one person that's their champion. And I want that person that, the mother, whoever that came for their child, to know that their child is being treated fairly. And I recognize they're there and they're trying to help their child. Another thing I do that's very unconventional, I keep snacks in my courtroom. If we have a long docket where people have been sitting in the room for 2-3 hours, from whatever reason we're waiting for attorneys, I'll distribute snacks in the courtroom. And there's a strategy to that as well. People that are more content are usually going to behave better in court. The other issue I always do is I take the bench and I do not leave the bench. The only time I leave the bench is if I'm going back to do a conference in my chambers. So when I get people in my courtroom, like, I've waited 3 hours for my attorney. I'm like, look, I'm waiting 3 hours here with you. I'm not going anywhere till you do. I understand your time's important, but hey, I'm the judge. If I can wait here 3 hours, you're going to wait 3 hours. And I think that has had a positive effect of keeping people more calm in my courtroom. I recently had, sometimes you wonder whether you're making a difference at all. And last week, every now and then something like this happens, and it does touch me. I had a lady come into my courtroom, and she came to visit me, and she had been a defendant on one of my cases on a probation revocation, and we'd worked with her, and she'd done everything she was supposed to do, and she went off probation. She came by to tell me she had started a new job in a neighboring building, which worked with people with prior criminal history. And she came by just to tell me that she got a job. She was on her break, and she's like, Judge, I wanted you to know how I was doing. And that touched me. I thought that was really, it's moments like that that make it worth doing this job, because I did something that affected that lady, that she felt that she could come back and tell me, and she knew that I cared about whether she was progressing or not.
But I think the description and a lot of what you just said really sets the tone for what people have hope for when they encounter coming into the courtroom. And you said, hey, I pulled some things from some other judges, but a lot of it, we've known each other for a lot of years. I would say, hey, that was a lot of you. That was a lot of your heart, your care for humankind. But let me ask you this. I mean, if we, me and you are around the same age and we grew up around the same period of time, and Judge, there was a period of time back, especially back in the 1990s, where, there was a crack epidemic. And, for the most part, young African-American men, young persons of color, especially men, were, basically charged, with either selling or distribution or to some nature, and sent off to county jails, prisons, and et cetera. And so we have this mass incarceration in which we experienced through the 90s. And then by the time we get to maybe the early 2000s, mid 2000s, we start to see where, oxy is taking over, meth and those type of drugs. And the court starts to talk about, catch court is talking about prostitution and human trafficking. It's also talking about mental health. It's also talking about restoration. What do you say to those who say, well, a lot of this could be racial inequality because the court wasn't saying that in the 90s? Or let me ask you this question. Did the court evolve in terms of some of its approaches and thinking?
Oh, I think it evolved. And I've told people I'm very clear. Now, obviously, I'm a white jurist. I'm not African American. I recognize I'm not African American. I try to recognize the disparities. Now, I always tell people, like, they might find unusual that I don't know if this changes my perspective, but when I got my master's in history is actually in African American history, the pre-Civil War South, and slavery and African American studies. Now,
I remember that.
Again, I'm a white guy that took that. And when I went for my master's degree, and they said, Bill, you could go on to your PhD, but the demand for Caucasian scholars in this field is pretty limited. And rightfully so. I can imagine if you're going to your introduction to African American history class, and it's taught by Billy Ray Hedrick, there's going to be. But I will tell you, when I got my history degree, I frankly chose an area that I didn't think I was super knowledgeable in. And I thought it was interesting. I also know I have a different perspective when I read this historical experience because it's not mine. But I also make a recognition. I will often look in my courtroom and I'm like, am I today? I'm like, I might be the only white person in this courtroom on some days. You know, it might be a lot of immigrant people or be people of color. Mm-hmm. Why is that? And I recognize there's some disparities there. And, you know, I would cover traffic court and I'm like, I have all these people. And I'm like, am I supposed to expect certain population groups are just the worst drivers on the earth and everybody is not? Right. It's there. And I think it's something we got to work on. I think and I agree with you 100%. When it was crack and it was affecting the African-American community, it was a criminal justice issue. When it became Oxycontin and the heroin epidemic, and that overwhelmingly affected the white population. And if you read the studies on how that drug issue came about, the Mexican cartel specifically targeted the white community, and it started from prescription drugs, but then it became a health crisis versus a criminal crisis. It's not good that happened, but I'm hoping that by that change of viewpoint, maybe the viewpoint changed on crack as well, and we became more sophisticated in what we were doing because, frankly, we were warehousing people. And again, there are some people that need to go to jail, but there are other reasons. There are disparities that are there. Now, one of the things I have to do as a judge, I recognize they're there, try to mitigate them the best I can, and try to keeping in mind other people's experiences are not the same as mine. And I recognize if I go somewhere with certain assumptions that there are certain issues that may not happen to me, that may not happen to one of my colleagues. You know, when I was in law school, I had several African-American classmates who would tell me if they lived on the East Coast and there were certain places they had to drive through, there were whole areas that they didn't feel comfortable stopping. I don't normally have that problem. And I know that. And that's because of the way I look and in my background. And whether I grew up rich or I grew up poor, I still acknowledge there's a certain level of privilege that is there. And it's something you got to acknowledge. And you try to work with people and you try to let them know you're going to treat them fairly. Do we always get the mark all the time? No. And I make mistakes like anyone else, and you have to think these things out. But I do think the system is trying to do better. I will say this court has definitely progressed over the years. You will see a great amount of diversity on this bench. We have 15 judges, and you know, if you're going to do what slots are people in, there are 4 white male judges on this bench. So we have a diverse female, we have African American judges, and we are going to have the first Muslim judge in the state of Ohio who's going to be taking the bench in January. So I think our bench here is starting to reflect what our population looks like. I will also say I started here in the 90s. Now, when I was a prosecutor and I started, the person I was then, I don't think would be the person I am now. You learn from your experiences, also because the culture changed, but also the bench changed. And I will tell you, I believe my colleagues are very fair and are very progressive. And I think most people, if they're charged in Franklin County, I hope they're treated fairly. And I at least think most people are at least treated with respect.
Now, you've been a person, you know, we've had dialogue and I know of some things. You've been a person who has tried to relatively connect with community even outside of the courtroom. Do you think that's because of your background, or do you think that the court in and of itself, or at least the system that you represent in and of itself, has a responsibility for that type of community connection?
I think there's a variety of reasons. Now, I also have a higher level of belief on what public service entails. And to me, public service entails not just doing the job, but being out in the community, particularly when you're an elected official. I was also heavily influenced by having worked for Janet Jackson and for Rick Pfeiffer. Rick Pfeiffer, when I was in environmental prosecutor's courtroom, he always was going out in the community. There wasn't Sunday, wasn't some church. He was everywhere. And I picked up a lot of that from him. But I legitimately enjoy doing it. I think it's important. I am elected by the citizens of this county. Now, I will also say I try to focus on areas of the city that I think or population groups that are being underserved by us. So I actually keep a notebook at home. I keep track of what events I go to. There are certain things I have on my calendar and I try to fulfill and I try to do these obligations. Like I try to go to once a month to Pastor Lamar's anti-violence march. I don't always go every month, but also if Pastor Lamar does something over on the south side of his congregation, I try to be supportive of that. And I also am cognizant many officials appear on election year in many communities and then they're never seen again. So I made it very clear when I ran, I said, look, I will continue to come. And if I don't, point that out to me that I am not. Another thing I do to stay out in the community, it's not just to be seen, but I think a certain level of humility needs to be shown to the public. I'm involved in a lot of litter cleanups in the city and the county. I originally started doing that because when I ran for judge in 21, it was COVID. There really wasn't a lot you could do to campaign. So I'm like, who's for littering? No one's for littering. So I go out so I have different groups in the city. There's a lady who's an activist over on the Hilltop, Miss Lisa Boggs, who's been known for years for servicing that community, and particularly her fight against blight and litter. She does a cleanup on Sullivan Avenue from 12 to 1 on every Friday. And I usually get out there at least 2 or 3 times a month. And I do that. It's 1 hour. I have a couple others I do. I do that, and I've been out there actually, and if Sullivan Avenue doesn't always have the best reputation in this city.
Right.
One day the police even drove by and they're like, Judge Hedrick, is that you? I've had a lady who was working and I was over there and it's like, you're the judge from downtown. I'm like, yeah. So I'm like, and I'm like, I'm over here picking up a used baby diaper, literally. But I think that's important. And I try to put that out there because I want the community to know that I do care. I want them to know I'm doing that when it's not an election year. I will not lie. I would like to sort of shame some of my fellow public servants to maybe get them to join me in doing some of this stuff, particularly when it's not an election year. So yeah, I do all those things. And I think because I do those things, at least the people that know me know it gives me credibility. Now, sometimes, there'll be pictures posted on it. I don't do it just for that reason, but I also tell people if you're not seen doing it, people don't know you do it at all. Definitely. So I think because I do it consistently, that gives me a certain level of credibility.
Well, let me ask you this, Fana, and I appreciate you sharing that because I think you're right. I think if your actions can not only be an example to those in which sometimes may find themselves in your courtroom, that in and of itself becomes a testimony. But I think also to your colleagues who are elected, who only show up to the churches, the Sunday before the election, I think it says a lot to say we have a responsibility even outside of our election time period. But let me ask you this, Judge, just as a closing question. You mentioned about how Judge Pfeiffer played a role and former City Attorney Janet Jackson played a role in terms of just your growth in the different roles that you've played from prosecutor to judge. What do you say to the next generation? What do you say to that potential law student or current law student or even the person in the prosecutor's office who says, I want to aspire to do some of the same things he's doing?
Well, I think one thing I take seriously that they did for me, I try to do mentorship. And I think all of us who have reached a certain point, we owe it to the future to do these things. So when I was at the prosecutor's office or even now as a judge, when I go out in the community, I'm like, if there's a student that wants to come and shadow me in court or come to the court and learn about the system, I encourage them. I've had a couple students come and they've spent some time with me and I've actually written them recommendations to go to law school. I think the advice I would give the young people is like, always keep trying, never give up. You don't have to know what you're going to be doing at that very moment. I did not plan this path that I'm on. It has worked out well for me. I've been very lucky. But I also acknowledge there's certain things that happen that wouldn't happen if I didn't have other people or situations help me. I didn't come from a lot of wealth or income. Pell Grants. I had government seated jobs when I was a young person. These were government programs. So student loans. I had student loans to go to college. So I can't say, hey, I'm completely self-made and I did this on my own. But I also had other people that were supportive. You got to find one, but ultimately you got to be your own champion as well. So the key is don't give up on yourself, or if you're not sure what you want to do, keep trying until you can figure out what you want to do, and try to do the best you can at what you do. Now, another thing, I always feel sorry, what I feel, and I try to live my life. There's a lot of people in the world, they're not bad people, but they live their lives each day and they're good people. They do, but I also think we all have a certain responsibility to try to do something a little extra. If it means you volunteer at one thing once a week, that's good. Because if every person would just do one little thing, I think the world would be just such a much better place. But we live in a world where there's a handful of people that seemingly are trying to have to take on the responsibility of doing everything for everyone. And I think we need to be in this together, and we all need to do things. Now I will admit, and this is not a religious program. I do think it. I don't talk about it a lot. Faith does play a role in my life. I'm a practicing Catholic. I come from the part of the church that believes in social justice. So I do believe I have a certain responsibility to give back to the community. And that is part of what I do. There is a religious belief system that is behind a lot of the things I do, but I don't necessarily announce that, because I always tell people, I think the things that I think are my strengths are probably influenced by my faith, but the things that aren't, maybe not. But I don't want people to judge based on that. I think you try to live as the example. But I think young people, again, I just think if they could find a mentor, that's very helpful. And I think that's something that's been lacking for a lot of people. And I was lucky. I had a very good teacher in high school. She lived to be 95 years old. I'm getting ready to go back to Indiana, and I plan on visiting her gravesite because she had a real influence on me. But again, I was very lucky. Janet was super supportive when she became city attorney, made it very clear, always supported me in my endeavors. And Mr. Pfeiffer was a great role model, and they both had very large influence on me. And I'm very fortunate that I worked for both of them.
Well, Judge Hedrick, thank you for taking the time to pull up a seat to the leadership table. I want to say personally, thank you for your insights on justice and leadership and compassion. They are not only inspiring, but they're needed. We live in a world today where we need individuals like yourself who are inside of the courtrooms every single day, leveling out a level of fairness. And to all of those who are watching, we want to encourage you to make sure that you share, subscribe, tell somebody about this episode. There may be perhaps a young person or somebody who needs to hear this journey of Judge Bill Hedrick. And to all of those who have pulled up a seat at the table, know that we don't take it in vain. We thank you for being a part of this episode. And until the next time, I want to encourage you to always to keep the faith. Take care.
Boxland Media. Think big.